What would happen if Earth stopped spinning? Chapter 1. The Last Turn of the World. I didn't hear the planet break. None of us did. There was no squeal of cosmic tires, no titanic clatter of gears seizing. The first sound was wind, an animal roar unspooling from every horizon at once, as though the atmosphere had remembered what we had forgotten, that it never truly moved with us, only with our permission. And now, that permission had been revoked. Imagine every object not anchored to bedrock, the oceans in their basins, the columns of air from the surf to the stratosphere, the trucks and trains and cities, scaffolds of dust and birds and seeds. For billions of years, these things carried the memory of the planet's whirl, calmly circling at roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, less toward the poles. That memory is inertia, and in the moment Earth's crust slammed from spin to stillness, all of that inertia refused to stop. It kept going. On the equator, the air dashed west to east at freeway speeds gone feral, a horizontal waterfall made of atmosphere. Skyscrapers didn't so much topple as peel, facades lifted like scabs. Asphalt rolled and furled like black tongues. Freight containers skipped like stones across the open plains. At sea, the water didn't roar like a wave, it heaved like a continent learning to breathe. Coastlines broke. Harbors detonated into walls of spray. Sailors on 10,000 routes looked up to see the horizon become a blade. People near the poles had a different morning. The wind still came, tens to hundreds of miles per hour is not a gentle thing anywhere, but their world didn't shear so violently because their slice of earth had always turned more slowly. Yet the sky over those latitudes became a highway for the displaced. Clouds tore into filaments. Birds became paper lifted, whirled, and lost. The aurora over the dark pole fluttered like a torn banner, then faded, as though embarrassed to be seen in daylight where it did not belong. What happens when a spinning world stops is not a single event, but a cascade of physics and human life colliding long before the science lessons, before news anchors tried to pronounce new terms for ancient forces. Each of us learned with our bodies. Wind that pinned you to a wall, dust that abraded skin raw, the taste of salt hundreds of miles inland, the sound of doors slamming in unison across a continent, and then a silence, brief, stunned, heavy. Somewhere, a pendulum came to rest, its plumb line free of its daily, delicate procession. Somewhere else, a child's top toppled on the floor and finally did not wobble back to grace. The planet was finished turning. The day we knew was gone. The first thing to understand is that there are two stories we must tell about a motionless Earth: the story of the sudden stop and the story of the eternal pause. They are cousins, but not twins. In one, the break is brutal, instantaneous, an impossibility in engineering terms, but straightforward in imagination. In the other, the planet somehow slows over generations until it locks to the sun, always showing the same face like a lover who never looks away. Both stories teach us, because both reveal what rotation, so ordinary we forget it, quietly gave to us. We will begin with the brutal story, because it begins with you. You are standing near the equator, in a port city, at a beach bar, beside a jungle river. You can feel the sweetness of late afternoon. The surf puts its tooth on the sand and draws away again. The bartender reaches for limes. You take a breath. The ground stops. You do not fly forward like a cartoon. Physics is less theatrical, more thorough. The ground, the bar, the sand, all of that stops beneath you. Yes, but so do you, because your feet, your joints, Your friction with the ground yank you into the planet's new stillness. It's everything else that surges, the unseen, the unmoored, air above all, which had been content to rotate with us, now refuses to be bribed by friction with the ground alone. The wind becomes a river whose bed is the line of latitude beneath your feet. Over minutes to hours, that river seems to turn the earth upside down, except it's only revealing how much of our world is air and water wearing a mask of calm. Inside the wind are other things, hidden until they are not. Grit in a billion sizes, industrial soot, the high breath of deserts, the fine talc of cities, needles from whole pine forests rubbed into powder, the white dust of corals rasped from shoals. The atmosphere becomes a library of our landscapes, each particle tagged with a place and flung into the next chapter. There are no continents that get to say, "Not me." The equator is worst, but even the polite latitudes learn to shout. Lakes leave their beds and return again. Rivers reverse, then remember their way, then sob in new directions, cutting channels where old ones evaporate. Anything that was marginal becomes dramatic. The levee you argued about at the county board? Gone. The hillside you knew was unstable, but not yet? Now. Engineers have always known the truth that poets love. Stability is a permission we earn, not a gift we are given. High bridges groan, the tallest ones, designed to dance a little with the wind, now try to dance with a partner that refuses to keep time. Airports become museums for a day. Runways that had known crosswinds become deserts of sheer. Pilots park their planes and curse routes they cannot see. When the first day ends, if a day can be said to end, the wind learns a new rhythm. It has to, because the planet's spin no longer curls it. There is no Coriolis to bend the air's will into spirals, no gentle nudge to birth our trade winds and jet streams, no instruction manual for the great swirls we called cyclones and called by names when they hurt us. Without rotation, the atmosphere's instinct changes. Where the heat is, it rises. Where the cold is, it sinks. The simplest behavior, the one that existed before we had weather maps, returns. The air attempts to flow directly from high to low, from cold to hot, like a breath across a flame. But now we are mixing stories, and we must be careful. The brutal stop and the eternal pause meet at the sea. You have seen a spinning dancer, arms outstretched, dress flaring. As she slows, the skirt obeys gravity more. As she stops, it falls into a truer shape. Earth was like that. The spin made our planet slightly fat at the waist, a gentle equatorial bulge. It made the sea deeper there, too. Only a few dozen meters of extra water held at the equator by the faintest relief from gravity, the centrifugal ease that rotation allows. Stop the spin, and gravity reasserts all her rights. The sea abandons the equator, creeps toward the poles, and keeps going. This is not a sudden swoosh, but an age of tide, a slow-motion redistribution that redraws maps with the patience of ice. The equator would watch its seas retreat a little, then a lot, revealing drowned lands, old shorelines, the bones of ancient reefs. New plains arise where galleons once sank, where satellites once saw only blue. Far to the north and south, shore towns discover they were always waiting rooms for the ocean's true arrival. The new polar seas rise and rise, not because glaciers melt, though they do, under their own rules, but because water, like any obedient crowd, goes where the pressure tells it to go. By the time your grandchildren are old enough to measure their height on the kitchen doorframe, the map is not merely altered, it is reauthored. Humanity gathers on a belt of continents closer to the equator than we ever expected, hugging the margin between the new deserts and the new marshes. Our cities reorganize around a geography humanity has never known. Equatorial heartlands crisscrossed by fresh riverbeds and polar archipelagos where forests remember they were once seas. Sailors relearn the planet. Cartographers become poets. The old myth of Atlantis breathes out and becomes 1,000 little truths at the equator's hem. Is the day still 24 hours? Someone asks in the first year when clocks feel like lies. The answer is not what we were taught in school, because the definition of day came from the turning that is no more. The earth still courses around the sun, rotation is not revolution, and the length of a year is unbothered by our tantrum. But if the world does not turn beneath the sun, then the sun takes a year to cross the sky. Noon is a season. Sunrise is a place you travel to, not a time you wait for. In each longitude, the sun will climb for months, hover in a long, lingering afternoon, and then descend over the same number of months. Light becomes a slope, not a switch. In the first cycle, cities learn to live with dawn that takes a quarter year to complete and night that lasts as long as a semester. We set our lives to a rhythm that was once the privilege of Arctic villages. On the sunward face, heat composes itself into a great, slow oven. On the night face, cold scoops the sky down until it crackles. The Terminator, the band of permanent sunrise and sunset, becomes the Goldilocks zone for the human heart. A ring of dim, forgiving light that circles the world where day is always almost. At first, we chase that ring like tourists. Then we build for it. Farms sprout in that twilight band, crops that forgive half-light and gift sugars patiently. Architects design cities with spines to turn their faces, not to follow the sun, but to persuade its angle into kindness. The old idea of time zones dissolves into something gentler and more local. Light districts, shadow districts, heat wards, frost wards, with no spin to twist storms. The old hurricanes do not return. Their ghosts run in straight lines now, from hot to cold, short-lived and furious, like exclamation points written by the atmosphere and forgotten an hour later. Dust storms and steam fogs become the punctuation of the new weather, the dash and comma of our ordinary days. What about the magnetic field? An astronomer asks on a radio show whose audience has doubled every week since the stop. We all become students again. Wonder makes us generous. The geophysicist on the other end breathes out and explains that Earth's shield against the sun's tantrums. The magnetic cocoon that deflects charged particles and paints auroras on the sky was born in the deep, convecting iron of our planet's core, corralling molten metal into a dynamo. Rotation helps that chore. The Coriolis force, which the atmosphere has now forsaken, whispers its order into the metal oceans below our feet. If the spin ends, the geodynamo does not fall silent at once, but its grammar changes. Over centuries, perhaps millennia, the field may wander, weaken, change its coat, or even fail for a long time. Space weather, once an occasional headline, becomes a climate in its own right. Whispers of radiation that alter how we fly, how we wire, how we dream under the stars. The first storms of space are beautiful in the way that the first waters of flood are beautiful. Night-side skies flower with curtains of light 1,000 miles long. People go outside to watch, and then hurry inside again when their phones alert them to currents kindled in long copper lines. Engineers begin to bury what was once strung in the air. Fiber becomes king. We rediscover, with a mixture of humility and pride, how to build a civilization that assumes less benevolence from the sky. It is tempting, in the fervor of catastrophe, to blame the world we have now on the world we had then, as if rotation were a crutch that kept us from becoming ourselves. But that is vanity, a vice of clever species. The truth is simpler and harder. We were lucky, and we were practiced, and we are both still. People learn. We always have. Fishermen who watched their harbors climb onto the land become riverboat captains on waterways that did not exist on their fathers' maps. Farmers follow the light band and plant varieties that listen to seasons, which are now a sun's slow walk, not a planet's brisk turn. School children memorize not just capital cities but ranges of habitable twilight, bands on the globe like the stripes on a sleeping animal. In the pause between panic and adaptation, though, there is grief. It would be dishonest to tell this story without the ache. There are cities we will never visit again, not because they are underwater or sun-cracked into ruin, but because they are impossible in the new geometry. A port that needed tides and trade winds is now 3,000 miles from the nearest navigable water. A ski town that needed winter is now a museum of cold in a place that chose twilight forever. We mourn what cannot be translated. Language helps. We rename things. The equator, once a mere mathematical circle, becomes a proper noun. We speak with new respect. The world's uplands, the land belt, the old sea's floor. The poles, once emblems of remoteness, become familiar as everyone's grandparents. Noon becomes a neighborhood. Midnight is a direction. The words do not remake the world, but they teach us how to be inside it. In the laboratories, nothing has stopped. Clocks, those exquisite ears pressed to the heartbeat of physics, find a new purpose. Without the daily drag and flutter of rotation, chronometers listen for subtler tides, the wobble of a planet's mass as oceans creep poleward, the tiny stretch and squeeze of the crust as mantle convection continues its overheated waltz. Seismologists read their graphs and hear, through the noise, the same thing we hear in our nights, that Earth is not dead, only differently alive. A year after the stop, a man walks across a plain that was once the continental shelf of a warm sea. He finds, half buried in silt, a wooden sign with flaking paint, a menu from a beachside cafe. The chalk lettering has gone, but the carved title remains, Today's Specials. He laughs out loud, not bitterly, not with regret, but as if he has caught a good joke by the tail. He props the sign upright, a small, kind monument to a civilization that took pride in the ordinary magic of lunch by the water. Then he keeps walking east toward the long, slow dawn. That is what we do now. We walk, we build, we draw the new map and write the new calendar. We learn that the last turn of the world was not the last turn of us. But our story is not finished. Many of the things the sudden stop took from us, the winds, the tsunamis, the shock to our geometry, belong to the first days of a still earth. What comes next belongs to the patient, to the planners, to the gardeners, and the grid makers, and the poets with rulers. When an earth without spin settles into its long embrace with the sun, the rules of climate, ecology, and human life remake themselves in patterns we can already begin to sketch. In the next chapter, we will stand on the edge of the new Terminator city-states and watch the sky become our teacher. We will learn how rivers run when day lasts months, how forests root themselves under a sun that migrates like a whale, how oceans speak without the old gyres, and how a magnetic field negotiates with a core that no longer knows which way is east. We will talk honestly about survival and adaptation, about the limits that warn us and the possibilities that invite us. We will imagine, not foolishly, not romantically, but bravely, how a civilization becomes native to a world that refuses to turn. For now, remember this: the day the earth stopped was the day we learned the loud way what motion had made for us. The days that followed taught us what stillness might yet allow. Chapter 2. the year-long day. By the second year after the world's last turn, the sky had ceased to be an emergency and became, instead, a teacher. What it taught was this: in the absence of rotation, simplicity returns with an iron hand. Hot air rises over the day side and flows toward the night. Cold air sinks on the night side and surges toward the day. The whole atmosphere tries to become one colossal cell, an immense, patient conveyor, looping from the bright hemisphere to the dark and back again. Where we had once diagrammed 3 stacked circulation cells per side, their boundaries braided by jet streams, now we drew only one, drawn so large that maps had to be rethought to hold it. Meteorologists, those translators of sky and sea, stood in front of new weather maps with old confidence. "This is the day-night overturning cell," they said, and the phrase entered ordinary speech like the name of a neighbor. The cell breathed in months. On the sunward face, air spent long weeks rising, dilated by the oven of noon. On the night face, it sank like a stone through star-cold clarity. In between, across the belt of permanent dawn and dusk, the Terminator band, the cell rushed sideways in 2 opposing rivers, eastbound at high altitudes and westbound near the ground, or the other way around depending on the local terrain that tugged at the flow. The jet streams that had once circled the planet like pulled taffy were gone. In their place ran a single, slow pulse. Not that the atmosphere became mild. Simplicity can be savage when stretched across an ocean. Along the Terminator, where the temperature gradient was steepest, winds sharpened. They were not the razor-straight gales of the first week. Friction with mountains and forests had taught them a crooked courtesy. But there remained a persistent strength in those twilight winds, enough to turn blade farms the size of counties, enough to carve dunes into migrating cities of sand. Sky engineers learned to see not only where the wind was, but when. A calendar of gust and lull bound to the sun's yearly walk. The sea, more stubborn than air, took longer to confess what the end of spin had done to it. Without the Coriolis force to shepherd surface currents into gyres, the old ocean highways unfurled. Ekman spirals, those delicate corkscrews of water set spinning by wind and rotation together, unspooled into something blunter. Upwelling off the old west coast slowed. In other places it intensified, guided less by a vanished planetary torque and more by the new geography of light. The day side warmed and formed a stubborn skin, a hot lens that the wind had to scratch to reach the cool below. The night side radiated heat into space with such diligence that leaden fogs became ordinary there. Fogs that collected on any surface softer than a polished stone, built rime on wires, made every morning an act of de-icing. As the equator shed its extra sea toward the poles, a migration measured not in tides but in textbooks, coastlines bit down on their grief and learned the belt around the equator lifted, drained, and breathed. Where continental shelves had once hosted reefs and shoals, flats rose into glare and heat. Salt pans glittered by the thousands, white lacunae in new tan maps, north and south. The rising polar seas did what water does best. They found any low place and laid a hand over it. Fjords extended their fingers. Estuaries surrendered their last sandbars and became inland bays. Delta cities either climbed, retreated, or discovered too late that negotiation with water still ends with the sea prevailing. Geologists found themselves carried forward by a shy gladness, not because of the harm, which they grieved, but because the earth, stripped of the spin that had once slightly redistributed weight, spoke more plainly through their instruments. The equatorial bulge, a difference of only a few tenths of a percent, but humanly vast, began to relax. The crust, elastically obedient, creaked toward a more nearly spherical shape. This rebalancing was not violent, it was inexorable. Some faults woke, stretching their backs after a long sleep. Some mountain ranges shrugged, exhaling rock dust. With better seafloor mapping of the new polar basins, the old grammar of tectonics ridges, trenches, the half-swallowed ruins of oceanic plates could be read like clear handwriting after a storm had smeared ink across the page. We learned again that beneath our roofs and roads, the mantle continued its slow convective ballet, indifferent to our calendars. If rotation had been a gentle bribe to gravity, magnetism had been the planet's soft shield. The dynamo in Earth's liquid outer core metal moving through magnetic fields persuading metal to move, had always used the Coriolis force as a kind of organizer. Without it, the dance did not stop, but the choreography lost some of its strictness. Over generations, the global field slackened, drifted, doubled back, or momentarily failed in favors to any one pole. Navigators put less trust in compasses and more into stars and inertial guides. Satellite operators learned to schedule their most sensitive tasks for the months when the day face turned away from solar tantrums. There were more auroras and sometimes more nosebleeds at the highest latitudes. We armored hospitals and grid nodes against geomagnetic jerks with the same seriousness we once reserved for storm surges and earthquakes. Space weather no longer sounded like a novelty, it was simply weather from above. What about the moon? The moon abided. It circled us the way it always had, raising and lowering the tides with a patience that made the old poems truer. The length of our day no longer gave the ocean its main slosh. Instead, the tides became a quieter conversation between Earth and its companion. Along the terminator, where water and air often found themselves in equipoise, the lunar pull created swells that could be predicted in calendars handed from farmer to fisher and back again. Children grew up knowing a month as something the wind could also feel. On land, the terminator quickly became more than a line on a globe. It became a habitat. Flora and fauna, freed from the repetitive stress of 24-hour cycles, were presented with a new choice: migrate with the light, or specialize under its absence or excess. The first answer was migration. Herds learned the slow arc of the sun and followed the terminator like pilgrim caravans, grazing fields that never saw more than a few hours of direct glare, then moving on. Birds that once traced north-south flyways now sketched rings around the planet, living perpetually in the gold of a permanent sunrise, riding the reliable winds that corralled insects into drifting banquets. Predators adapted. Some became runners of astonishing endurance, shadowing the herds over months and raising their young in relay shelters that dotted the migration routes. Others vanished into the night face and learned to hunt by breath and heat alone beneath skies bright with unfamiliar stars. Plants are slower, but no less ingenious. Botanists documented 3 great strategies. The first was the terminator opportunist. Fast-growing annuals that sprouted as the gray light approached sprinted through their flowering under weeks of slanting sun and set seed just as the gloaming tipped to true night. The second was the dayward fortress. Thick-leaved, reflective again, all silver hairs and wax, using daylight like a miser uses inherited wealth, rooting into aquifers that had once been rivers and now ran below the new plains. The third was the night hothouse. Forests on the dark side, watered by condensation and fog, their metabolism slowed, their leaves broad and black, soaking what little scattered starlight and bioluminescence the understory organisms provided. Agriculture, which had always been the art of arranging ecology to serve the table, adopted all 3. Terminator farming became the first great project of the still world. It began with shelters for people and seedlings and expanded until entire counties became machines for comfort. Imagine a city whose plan rotates not as a gyroscope, but as a coordinated turning of its public life so that schools, markets, clinics, and workshops face the current angle of the sun with architectural empathy. Imagine walls that breathe not as a metaphor but as a measured exchange of heat and humidity, using salt hydrates and phase change slurries to bank coolness during the night and release it during the day. Imagine fields roofed in high lattices, nothing so crude as a greenhouse, but a diaphanous shading that moves like a jellyfish, its fabric programmed to select not only the amount but the spectrum of light. Water, the first and last necessity, taught humility hardest. On the day side, open reservoirs were simply invitations to the sky. Engineers learned to store water beneath, in cisterns where evaporation could be rationed. On the night side, fog nets rose like harp strings across valleys, combing liquid from air thick as dream. Ice houses reappeared, no longer nostalgic curiosities but deliberate machines that married cold with salt and made both available by design. Months later, a town's persistence braided into crystal. The new rivers were stories in themselves. Without the spin that paints river basins with subtle biases, and with the equator's lift altering slopes by centimeters that mattered, drainage patterns redrew themselves. A ridge that had been a watershed spine found itself a shallow hinge. A basin that had once gathered rains now refused water and sent it seeping toward the night. Inland seas bloomed and then shrank as the balance between day heating and night condensation shifted with the seasons of the year-long day. In twilight cities, planners learned to love maps printed in pencil. Anything inked would lie within 2 summers. Power, once counted chiefly in watts and politics, found a new arithmetic. Dayward solar farms bloomed in rings, not as deserts plated in glass, but as trellis works teaching light to do more than one job. Shade barley, run pumps, feed batteries, preheat the air for kilns. On the night side, wind was steady enough to be trusted like the tide. It flowed like breath through mountain passes that saw no sun for months and needed no convincing to turn turbines, whose bearings were lubricated by oils that did not congeal at 50 below. Geothermal fields became more than local curiosities. At the equator's new uplands, where the crust had elastically stretched and thinned, heat was nearer. People built towns around warm ground the way they had once built them around harbors. We had to learn to store power, heat, time. The year-long day demanded a year-long patience. Batteries grew heavier, yes, but they also grew stranger. Gravity banks using elevators to lift weights during the bright season and let them down again in the dark. Ammonia loop systems that embodied energy into molecules and released it back to flame and generator as needed. Salt caverns that held hydrogen not as a promise, but as a plan. The grid ceased to be a single thing that could fail like a dropped plate. It became a lacework of microgrids that courted and separated like dance partners, exchanging power and goodwill, refusing to let any single shock cascade across landscapes already brave with rediscovery. Schools changed their calendars, not because children prefer novelty, they do, but because light demands respect. In Terminator districts, the academic year began at dawn and ran until dusk, with festivals written for the slow months of high sun and long night. In dayward fortresses, long siestas were not an affectation. They were essential civic rituals, keeping the city's metabolism in time with the overhead furnace. Nightward towns, those built around industries that loved the cold, like materials, fabrication, and certain kinds of computation, kept festivals for the moon. Nights when it rose like a lantern, when its reflected light, strengthened by snow and fog, made the world silver enough to read by. Law followed. Not the law of physics that had arrived first, but human law, that honest attempt to turn custom and kindness into something we can find in a book. The idea of time zones fell over gently and slept. In its place came light codes, ordinances tied to the angle of the sun, to the intensity of the permanent twilight, to the risk of glare. Building inspectors carried spectrometers. Flight rules depended as much on auroral forecasts as on visibility. Labor rights recognized that a 6-month day and a 6-month night are not just longer versions of what we had before. They are modes of being that require different protections. Light leave became as ordinary as parental leave. The youngest among us grew up with a more intimate vocabulary for sky and season, and they wielded it without boasting. There were places we declared too tender to press with settlement. The night-side refuges, deep valleys quilted by fog, forests that invented their own luminescence, were set aside with a seriousness that surprised even the cynical. The dayside, in its fiercest quarters, birthed rock gardens that no foot was permitted to tread until the plants there had told us, by thriving, that they wanted company. The terminator drew our greatest temptations. A line that favorable, that fecund, that wealthy in harvest and wind, is also a line where we could have made every mistake we had already made once, strangling the land with roads, choking rivers with our impatience, crowding out every species that did not pay rent in coin. We did those things again, at first. Then, reminded too vividly of what loss can do to a century, we learned to design differently. The second ring of cities, and the third, wore green belts that were not afterthoughts, but their premise. Fields were interleaved with hedgerows and wild corridors so deliberate that deer learned to use them as commute routes. We wrote easements for whales, legal corridors in the new polar seas where ships knew to hush. Of course, there were failures. Stories of adaptation read too easily when told from the comfort of hard-won stability. They are chunked by headings, as if the headings had written reality. In truth, miscalculations became teachers, one invoice late. A terminator settlement swelled too fast and discovered that its water model had been a hope. A nightward technology park gambled on a magnetic field that persisted just long enough to convince them it would persist forever, then shuddered under a storm from the Sunday. An equatorial nation, proud and newly wealthy with minerals on lands raised from the old sea, learned that sovereignty is not a word you can write across a map without also writing it across a people. We apologized, sometimes too late. We corrected, often clumsily. We wrote new charters that tried to make amends in advance. Culture did not merely survive, it became more local and more planetary at once. Local because light taught each place to be itself. Planetary because the year-long day made our differences legible to one another. Music took cues from skies. On the day side, percussion loved the shimmer of heat. On the night side, bowed strings found a sweetness that sounded like breath made visible. Literature learned to describe time again. Novels measured longing across the months of a descending sun. Epics began at dawn and ended at dawn, because there are ways to tell a story that require a full traverse of light. We invented holidays unique to the slow geometry. Dimming, the week when the sun seemed to hesitate at its highest angle before remembering its descent. First fog, when nightward orchards bloomed under lamps and moths. Auroras lone, when the dayside briefly stole a notch of the night's color during a magnetic storm. We kept science. In a still world, experiments grew delicate. With the frantic stutter of daily heating gone, climate researchers could watch processes that had been hidden in noise. They learned how soil breathes when it refuses to be hurried, how microbes apportion their small economies in a darkness that lasts long enough to have subcultures, how cloud droplets learn manners in an atmosphere with fewer vortices to shove them around. Telescopes on the night side, protected by law, gaped at a sky undisturbed by the strobe of day and air mass changes every 15 minutes. They saw the slow wink of worlds around other stars and sent their news with a calm we had earned. We kept play, not as distraction, but as proof of life. There are sports that can only be played in 6 months long dusk, endurance games that map a community's stamina to its trust, sail races that follow the Terminator until a team has circled a hemisphere, ski festivals on the night side where the snow is so dry that it powders into light with every turn and the only sound is the hiss of edges. Children drew their houses with 2 roofs, one to shade, one to shed frost. Couples planned weddings for dimming and births for first fog. Grief did not leave us, but it learned to sit at a table with joy and not interrupt as rudely. Did we ever discover why the earth stopped? We asked. At first, as if there must be a villain or a hidden parameter we had neglected. We built instruments with names as long as their antennas. We listened to the core, to the mantle, to the flex and sigh of the crust. We measured the angular momentum of everything that could be coaxed into confessing it. The best answer was the quietest. There was no finger on a brake. A cosmic event beyond the reach of our telescopes, the dissipations of tides over eons, a coupling between core and mantle that found a mode we had not imagined. Physicists proposed models, argued, conceded, refined. The planet did not care to disclose its private reasons. As happens in any good marriage, curiosity endured but ceased to be suspicion. We wrote our story forward, even without a preface we could agree on. By the 50th year, visitors from a dayward city could travel to a nightward town and still be surprised by the weight of the stars, by the way breath fogs inside the nose, by the sound of wind made visible by frozen crystals lifted off a lake. By the 100th, children who had never known a spinning world visited museums where Foucault pendulums hung in glass domes and were told, with a smile, that the pendulum once proved that the world turned. The pendulum still swung, of course. They were beautiful, but they no longer recorded a rotation, only a world where gravity and patience held everything in a lucid balance. And the Terminator cities, those belts of nearly permanent dawn, wrote the future. They became the ports of a new sea, the sea of light's edge. Their universities taught lightcraft, a discipline mixing architecture, agronomy, sky physics, and law. Their politics were often dull in the best way, thoughtful, iterative, allergic to the cult of crisis. Dull politics kept infants fed in aurora storms from punching holes in hospital power. Their art was anything but dull. Painters learned to work with a spectrum that behaves differently at shallow angles, how blue refuses to be banished when the sun sits forever low. Filmmakers invented long takes that could be told only when a shadow moves the distance of a street across a season. The last superstition to evaporate was our gilded nostalgia for a day. It returned like any good craving when we were tired or unwell. People wrote late-night letters. Night was always late, wherever you stood wishing to wake again at 6, to have lunch at noon and dinner at 7, to fall asleep without a calendar. Familiarity is a narcotic, but the children of stillness taught us kindness. They brought us to the threshold at the edge of town at dimming and said, "Listen." We listened. Frogs invented rhythms that took months to complete. Trees exhaled sugar at a tide that could be tasted in the insects that fed on them. The wind, no longer folded by jet streams, told a simpler tale, warm, then cool, then cold, then warm again, with changes so slow you could fall in love with them. What would happen if Earth stopped spinning? Had once been a classroom question meant to startle students awake. The answer had always been physics and panic. Now, the answer was longer and less theatrical. The winds would howl, the seas would move, the sky would find a new grammar. We would adapt, because life loves a boundary and learns it. We would draw cities along a band of permanent dawn, grow wheat under lattices that sift light, build wind harps where once we built smokestacks. We would lose things and name them well enough to mourn them properly. We would find new things and practice gratitude without shame. We would make a calendar from the sun's slow walk, and we would be not survivors of a disaster, but natives of a different ordinary. If you stood now on a hill near the equator, a real hill, limestone and scrub and the sudden dart of a lizard, you would look out across land that had been seabed and see, far away, the pyramids of shade that mark a Terminator city's towers. Above them, the sun would hover, neither cruel nor kind, only immense. You would feel the wind with its trustworthy pull. You would hear, if the night side was near, a hush like held breath. And if the day side was near, the tink of expanding metal in roofs that had been designed not to complain. You would know that beneath your feet a planet continued its silent labors, core stirring, mantle flowing, crust flexing toward roundness, and that above your head a magnetosphere still bargained with the sun to spare us its worst moods. You would also know, if you stayed long enough to learn the local songs, that someone in the city below was playing a flute made from a reed that grew only in twilight, and that the melody requires a patience you did not have when days were short. You would know that patience now. You would be home. The earth stopped. The story, at last, did not.